Hello and welcome to another session of problem solving with Elixir. In this video, we are going to talk about naming functions, and one of the features of Elixir that allows us to name our functions in a way that makes the code more readable and understandable. So what do I mean by that? And we'll look at one of the features here, that is of having two functions with identical names. So let's start with an example here. So we're going to start a mix project called greeting, and once we are in the greeting, we are going to remove greeting file from lib and the test greeting file from the test. So once we have that, let's create our first file to work. I'm just going to call it greet.ex, and we have something to work on. All right, so we're going to start with a simple module function, and we're going to call a function greet that does not take any argument, and it produces a string hello world. Next, we are going to define another function. We are going to call it greet person that takes a name and produces a string with the name of the person. Let's test our functions at this point. So we are going to fire up an IX session, and we're going to say greet.greet, and it says hello world. And then we are going to say greet.Martian, and it says hello Martian. So up until this point, we know the structure. We needed two functions. One produces a fixed string, while other interpolates the string based on the name that we have provided it. So let's look at these two functions, and we note that although they are distinct in their implementation, the nature of the two functions is quote unquote similar, right? Both are producing some kind of greeting. So before we try to get into the feature of Elixir, let's try to see what happens if I call the greet function with an argument, right? So we call the greet function with an argument. We get an error saying undefined function error. So this is interesting that Elixir is saying you don't have a function called greet, but we do have a function called greet. But reading further into the error message, we learn a little bit more about how Elixir interprets and sees individual functions. So it is saying greet/1 is undefined. Did you mean greet/0? So this kind of alludes us to the fact that Elixir is identifying function by two attributes. One, the literal name, in this case greet, but then the second is the number of arguments. So this /0, the 0 is called as the arity of the function, and it simply means the number of arguments that the function is going to take. So a greet function with 0 argument is completely different and independent from a greet function with 1 argument. And since in our code we have defined a greet function with 0 argument, it knows that it exists, so it is kind of pointing you to that, did you mean greet 0? And it knows that we do not have a greet function defined with 1 argument, so there is no way it can execute that function. Just to make sure that that is the case, let's again call our greet function with 2 arguments, right? And notice that now it says greet /2 is not defined. So we can define functions with the exact same name but having different number of arguments. So this allows us to simplify our second function by not thinking of a different name to it, but instead giving it the exact same name but a function that takes 1 argument. So now if we look at it, we have 2 functions called greet. One takes no argument, that's at the top, and then another one that takes 1 argument. So let's recompile and then try to see how it works. So we call the function greet with no argument and it gives us hello world. And then we call the function greet with 1 argument and it says hello Martian. So this makes our code in a way simpler to read and interpret. When a consumer is reading it, they would notice that, okay, I have 2 functions greet, so they must be producing some kind of greeting. And then you would know that there's one greet that takes no argument and another one that takes 1 argument. In later videos, we'll see that this helps us even more in designing functions that are more readable, clear, and concise.